All right, welcome to class. Happy Wednesday. So, I wanted to start off, since we have our first lab tomorrow, just opening up the floor to any questions about Lab 1. One question I've gotten a couple times, so I'll just start with answering that. Do you have to go to lab? No, you don't have to go to lab. The only reasons to go to lab are if you want help on anything, and in particular the lab, but also you can get help from the TA on anything in the class. But if you want help in person in the lab, or if you want the TA to grade your lab right then, and you'll know that you've got 100%, and if they told you something was wrong, then you could work on it in lab, and as long as you turned it in before the end of lab, then you could fix that. So getting it graded or getting help. If you don't need those things, you just want to turn it in on D2L, you don't have to go to lab. So there's that one question out of the way. But if there are any other questions, I am happy to answer them. Or if you think of any later, you can post them on the Discord. There is a channel. Yeah, there's a question.
What's a good timeline for starting on like the larger project 1, 2, 3?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it depends on your experience with Java. Right now, we're just really learning Java syntax. If you have been programming in Java or have a lot of programming experience in general, and you're sitting in lecture and you're like, yeah, of course, I know all of that, then I think you can wait a little longer to start the project. If you can't follow in lecture, I would try to get started on those. Really, you can't start too early. Maybe you open it up and you're like, wow, we haven't covered this at all. Until today, we'll start covering writing our own classes, but that's what Project 1 is, and so if you're not familiar with that at all, then it would be hard to start. But you can always look at it and make sure that you can run the sample code. You can do that anytime, even if we haven't covered the topic. Does that help? Yeah. Any other questions? Cool. So today, to start off, as sort of a warm-up and finishing off what we did on Monday, we didn't get to the sort of partner activity to practice working with for loops and arrays and scanner. And so what I wanted to start off with, if you all go to, or in a minute, you can do it right now, or you can do it once you're with your partner. If you go to the Lecture 3 page, and we copy into a Java class, I'll put it back in, let's see, where am I at with my day 3? Maybe I already have one. Maybe I pasted this in here already. But who knows what I have in here, so I'm just going to paste what's in there. And so we got through most of this on Wednesday. We learned about using scanner, we learned about for loops, we learned about arrays, and so just as a reminder of all that, what I'd like us to do is get with a partner. I'll tell you all the instructions first, and then you can find a partner. I really want you to make sure that you get a partner if you don't have a laptop right now that can run Java, you haven't gotten your IDE set up, you're stuck on something, make sure you get a partner so that you can actually work on this. But let's have everyone get a partner, get in groups of 1, 2, or 3. And I'd like you to try to get 5 integers from the user and store them in an array. And one hint that you can use is that the method for scanners to get integers is nextInt. So just as a reminder, if I've made a scanner object for myself, like input, which we already have, you can use what we have from earlier. That means I would call nextInt using the dot notation. But you can look back up and use what we did on Wednesday. So yeah, let's find a partner or two. Make sure if you can't run Java, you do find a partner and work on this problem. We will take no more than 10 minutes for this, maybe less if people are doing well. So go ahead, find a partner. Thank you. Also, if you're super stuck, feel free to raise your hand and I will come get you unstuck.
So yeah, I think we should.
That hand?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I probably should
And then we're going to do the scan together next slide. And that equals I value that and I think we have to create the object first, then we can use it. So like here, this one's like near my object. Yeah. We gotta do that outside, so we said 3 to 5 seconds. Input is
I think it's because we haven't used it. Yeah, we signed I about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that would get that. But
Well, it's asked all the time.
Inside your name, so each input dot whatever.
Don't you need like input to be indexed to where you want to?
It's the same thing, simple sort of strings. I think you're trying to do too many things.
That's great. Oh, you're trying to do different words. Yeah. I don't know if it's going to
Do it. Doesn't know what I is.
all right, let's bring it back together. So one one thing, hopefully nobody got too stuck on this, but you always have to remember that, if you're just pasting code in, you got to make sure that the name of your file matches the name of the class that's being defined in the file. So my class is array demo here, and that's what I pasted in over here. And so if the file that I made in Eclipse or my editor or wherever, my whatever IDE that I'm using, wasn't already called array demo, then I would need to change the name of my class to match the name of my file. And also I need my package to match the actual package that I'm in. So let's get this one done together. I'm actually going to comment out in this file just some of the other print statements that I have, just so that we have a clean thing here. Hopefully this works. I just want it to run and not do anything. Okay, so would anybody like to tell me where I might start for trying to accomplish this task? Sure.
Create an array of 5 integers.
Yeah. So, can anyone tell me can someone tell me what that looks like? Sure.
It's int brackets, whatever you want to call the array.
Yeah.
Equals new int bracket 5 bracket close bracket.
Yeah. Exactly. So the syntax for creating an array, we have the data type, then we have the bracket saying this is a 1D array. We have the name of the variable. I've called it numbers because it's going to hold numbers. And then we use the keyword new, and then we have the data type again, and we say the size of the array here. Okay, so once I have this, what would be a next step that I could take?
Open the scanner.
Yeah, so I could open the scanner if I don't already have it. I just kept the one from this file, so I already have it up here actually. So mine is called input, and it's of type scanner. So I have it. What else can I do? Yeah. Yeah, you want to tell us how we do that? Yeah.
0. You do semicolon and say I less than 5. Semicolon and you say I plus plus.
Yeah, so I'm going to make a for loop that's going to evaluate these, or create these variables I that'll take the values 0 through 4. And then what do I want to do inside the for loop? Yeah. Yeah, so I want to get some input, so maybe I'll ask for it each time. That could work. So I could say enter an integer, and then how am I going to get that? How about I get the integer and store it in the array? How would I do that in one line? Yeah.
Numbers bracket I.
Yeah. So I'm assigning numbers at the index I to be whatever my scanner called input gives me or receives as the next int. So that's looking good, and I'm just going to so let's just make sure this runs. Okay, I'm going to enter an integer. I'm just going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 because that's easy. I know I've done 5. And we're not actually printing anything out. But to check it, can someone, or one thing we could do to check it, let's just use a for each loop to check the contents of the array. So I'm going to say for, I'll say number, colon, numbers. Wait, okay, this is an int, right? Let me know if I got the syntax wrong there. We'll just hope for the best. And now I'm going to print number, and we can check that this actually worked. So again, I'm just going to do my easy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it looks like I successfully stored them. Did anybody try just printing out the entire array and getting anything weird? Do you have a question or comment?
No, I got the location. And
Yeah. So you are anticipating. So, you know, if you want to check your work, like I did, you might be tempted to just print out the array numbers. But if you do that, we'll try a different set of integers here, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. If you did that, you get something that is kind of confusing because we just checked that it has these numbers in it. And as Forrest, that's right, as Forrest noted, what we're seeing here is actually the memory address of the object, not its contents. And we'll actually come back to this at the end of lecture today. Okay, any questions on this before we move on? Great. So the lab is also going to get you some even more practice with loops, arrays, and scanner. But we are going to move on to today's topic, which, oopsies, will be classes and objects to start. So, does anybody want to offer up their any ideas about the differences between procedural programming, which is sort of what we've been doing, and object-oriented programming? Any thoughts on the differences between those? Yeah.
Object-oriented programming is like classes and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of weird because so far with our Java programs, we've had to define this class, but we haven't been defining our own classes and using our own objects. We've really just been sort of using it as more procedural programming, where we just have commands, we have data, but it just stands alone. We might define functions that manipulate that data, or manipulate that data as we go. But with object-oriented programming, we are putting the data and the functionality together. And this can be really nice to organize a program. And at least how I think of it is Java, object-oriented, used a lot in industry, which kind of shows you how writing object-oriented programs is a great way to have big collaborative projects. And so it's really good to practice, even if and my hope is it will become a lot more natural as we go, even if procedural programming might to some people feel more natural, but we will really be focusing on object-oriented programming now. So let's go to our first class that we're going to define, which is just going to be a counter, an object that can just keep track of a count. So I'm going to take this code and paste it into a new class inside. I already have a day 4 Java package, And let's see, this is going to be called counter. And I'm just going to paste this code in, and we will see the basic parts of a class. So in general, we have fields or instance variables. For our counter, what this looks like is it's just an integer called count that's going to keep track of a count. We're going to come back, especially on Friday. We're going to talk a lot more about what do these public and private keywords mean. For now, you know, they're here, but we don't have to concern ourselves too much. Another part of our classes will be constructors. And here you can see that we have two different constructors. These will be called, when we initialize an object of type counter, or, you know, whichever constructor we call will be called. We often, here you can see that we actually have the same, you know, we call it the same way, but in one constructor we don't pass in a parameter, and in the other we do pass in a parameter. Also, I guess one thing that this program is showing us is how Java ignores white space. So if this was Python, you know, before we've always seen, at least how I've been writing them, we've always been writing our methods with our curly braces on different lines. But here we can see that, oh, we have a blank constructor. I can just put this all in one line and Java's totally happy with that. Same here. Previously we've been putting this on a new line and, like, you know, it's been looking something like that. That's fine. But again, if you just have a super short, in this case, constructor, but also for these methods, you can just, as long as you have these curly braces and as long as you end your statements with a semicolon, white space doesn't matter. So yeah, and we'll see how these constructors get called in a bit. We also have some methods for our counter class, things like getCount, which is just going to return the current count, increment, and again, like the constructors, we can have two definitions with the same name, but it will just matter whether we pass in a parameter here. So if we call increment without a parameter, we're going to call this one. If we call increment and we do pass in an integer, then we'll call this one. And we'll execute a different method. And finally, we also have the method to reset the count to 0. Can anyone tell me what this second, what int and void is doing here? Oh, you have a question.
Yeah, I was going to ask where delta came from.
Yeah, well, so when we call it, I guess I'm covering it up, huh? So when we actually have one of these counters, which we'll see in a second, we will define what delta is when we call the method increment. So we'll have a counter, we'll call the method increment, and we'll either call it with nothing, with no argument, or we'll call it with, and we'll pass in an integer. And if we do pass in an integer, then we will be calling this method, and the variable delta will have the value of the integer that we passed in.
Oh.
And it's very possible, would it make more sense if it looked like this? Yeah, so this is definitely something, if you're used to Python or anything like that, being used to the fact that white space doesn't matter. Of course, we often use white space to make our programs easier for humans to read, but the computer is not reading. I just added a bunch of white space. The computer's not going to read this any differently than it did before. Yeah.
So just for another comparison to Python, like the increment is clearly the same process in this Java code.
Mm-hmm.
We're defining it with the brackets and whatnot. So the Python crossover would be define the function, then here's what it does. But is the increment in both of these iterations the same object in memory, or is it two separate objects?
Like the definition of
Like is
the
it taking
class?
up more space, or is it the same increment?
So I actually don't know. I do think that you could do the exact same thing in Python, from what I recall. And yeah, my instinct would say that in Python we would do something very similar. You know, I forget what the Python syntax is, but say it's something like class counter, you know, and I don't remember if is it like init or something, and I think you
have to
these
pass
must,
arguments.
oh yeah, you do self,
Yeah.
yeah, and then you would do, so, but my guess is in Python, you know, okay, suppose this is the constructor, okay, sure, but we might also have a method. We could also have increment, and my guess is we would also have self. This is confusing to you because Python has self. Don't worry too much about that. But we might have something like count plus plus. Oh, we don't need that. And then we could also, my guess is we can also have multiple versions of the same method that have different inputs. I guess I'm not sure, but yeah, in terms of like...
In terms of the Java side, it's the same object.
Yeah. Yeah, and let's see. Okay, so yeah, what can anyone tell me what this int and what this void, what those are? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So if we want, when we're defining our methods, if we don't want them to return anything, which a lot of times we don't, we just want to manipulate the object state, then we're going to have to return void. Other times, we do want to return something. I want to get the count, so I need to return the count. And if I had void here, I'm not going to be able to run this because errors exist in the project, which you probably can't see with that tiny writing, but that's what it's saying. So I'm going to have to change this back. So yeah, just like functions in Python, or also if you took 127, you did define your own classes in Python. And oh, I guess you didn't have to specify what you were returning in JavaScript, but.
What happened if you didn't have void there? Could you still manipulate?
So yeah, let's try. So this, yeah. So like in Python, I use Python a lot, but I still don't know for sure. My guess is in Python you don't have to specify a return, like, I'm sure you don't have to specify a return type, but here you do have to specify a return type. Even if, even if I'm not returning anything, I have to specify that I'm not returning anything with the void. Cool. So let's actually instantiate one of these, maybe more than one. So I'm going to make another, okay, so organization-wise, one way that we can actually, we can have files that define our classes, and then we can have different files. I'm going to call it counter demo, that actually run a program that use the classes that we define. So this is one way that we can organize our programs. So here I've made a new Java file. I called it counter demo, and this one has a main function. One thing that we could have pointed out here, and maybe I'll make this, I'll delete my white space so that we can get it all on the screen again. But this file has no main function, and so we can't run it, or like, you know, we don't run anything if we run it. So as long as these two files are in the same package, then I don't have to do anything special. I can start manipulating, I can start creating counter objects here. So, all right, in this first line, I declare a counter variable that I've called C. But I didn't call the constructor, and so it's not actually constructed yet, it's just declared. This is just the same as, you know, when we did things like int I, you know, I equals 50. It's exactly the same, except we're just working with our own class that we defined, counter. Here is an example of constructing a counter. It's reference, it sends its count. Oh, it's reference to C. Yes. For now, we're going to say this counter object C, this counter object is assigned to the variable C. And now we can use dot notation, just like we did in Python, to call methods. So we can call the method increment, like we saw with no input, and that increases the value by 1. And I messed up here, but we can also call it with some delta value, which has to be an integer, and we can increment it by 3 more. And then if we call the getCount method on C, and we save what is returned to us in a variable temp, which has to be of type integer, this will be 4. And so we can actually test this by printing out temp, and let's see what happens. Indeed, we got 4. So our counter is successfully keeping track of those values. We can also call the method reset. So coming back here, we've called the counter constructor. We've called both of our increment methods. We've called getCount and we've called reset. And the reason that we could call those is because we defined them. We defined this constructor. We defined getCount increment with an argument, an integer argument, and we defined reset. Yeah.
So as long as all the classes are in the same package, only one class has a main argument, I guess, then they'll all run just fine.
Yeah, I could have another file that defines a counter, you know, a container that's going to hold a bunch of counters, or maybe I have a totally separate object that I need to define. Yeah, I could define them in other files. Another thing I wanted to show is that we can actually, so I think a nice way to do this, and I guess the way that I set it up for you in the project, is to have these separate files, one that's sort of like a runner or like a driver of the program, and one that defines the class. But we can also have this main inside the class. This will also work. I guess let's see if it's going to get confused. Okay, no, it's not confused. So this would also work. Did you see how I just pasted the main function over to the class? Yeah.
Is there a benefit to doing it one way or the other, or is it
So, I mean, if we were defining multiple classes, then it would probably make sense to have them in different files because, like, why would counter be the one that has main, maybe? So I think organizationally, it's nice to have them separate. But this will also run. But so that's just to show that that works. I'll put it back over here. Okay, so just like things like integers, like I can make multiple integers. That's totally fine, right? I can make an int. I'll call it number 1, number 1, and it's going to be 4. And I'm going to make int number 2, and it's going to be 6. Like, great, I have a number here and I have a number here. I can also make multiple instances of counter, or in general of any class. So here I've created a second counter called D, and but here we're calling the constructor that takes in an initial value. And so now, because I'm calling increment on D, so D started with a value, our counter D had a value 5, and we increment it, and then it has a value 6. Again, good to check these things. Can anybody tell me what I should pass as an argument here to check what value my D counter has? Yeah, d.getCount, and now we will see that indeed, as we predicted, it has a value of 6. Okay, so we've now seen our first class. We will keep doing this pretty much every day, so don't worry too much if there's still some things that are confusing. But any questions before we move on to one last topic for the day? Cool. So the last thing I wanted to cover today, I'm going to just make one last Java class. I think the code is also up here. Oh, I guess I was just going to start with a blank one. I'm going to call this more with data types because there are just a few little things that I wanted to show. So, this is going to need a main method. Okay, let me go back to the lecture page and see what we wanted to cover. Okay, we got everything for classes and objects. So our last thing's about data types for today. So first off, we've kind of touched on this already, but in Java we have primitive data types. The main ones that we use are Boolean, maybe char, int, float, double, but there are a couple other ones. And the important, like for example, I might have a Boolean that I call flag, whose value is true. I might have a double, whose value is temp, and whose value is 98.6. And the important thing about primitives is what they're actually storing is the value itself. And so what this means is, if I use the assignment operator to create a new variable from an existing variable, so for example, I define temp2 to be equal to whatever temp is, what this is actually doing is it's really copying the data stored in temp, which is the double 98.6, into the variable temp2. And so if I change temp2, say by using the plus equals operator to add 5.3 to it, then I guess, so first off, let's check what these both are. So I'm going to print temp1, temp equals, and then I'll use the concatenation operator, and then I'll print out temp2. Oops, I'm going to put a comma. And I'll print out temp2. So before I do this, okay, so those two things are equal. That's probably what we would expect. And now if I do something like add five to temp2, well, I don't expect that to change the value of temp1, right? Like, let's take a look at this. My first temp is still 98.6, and temp2 is 5 greater than it was before. That's kind of logically makes sense to us. And that's happening because these are primitive data types. But on the other hand, we also have reference data types, which are classes. So both those that we define and those that are defined as the Java standard library or overall Java library. So for example, if we make a counter just like we had before, and then we make another counter and we assign it to be whatever C is, we get some maybe unexpected behavior if you don't know about reference data types. So let's say we change D. We can do just something like d.increment because we defined that. Now, okay, I'm getting D's count, right? I call d.getCount. Anybody have a guess? What should it be? I was hearing 6. Exactly. We started with 5. We added 1. So let's check that. And okay, great. That makes sense. Now, what happens if we do, I'll just copy this. What about C? Anybody want to tell me what I'm going to get when I call this on C? Yeah, I'm going to get 5. Excuse me. No. Great. Thank you for your answer. You would think I would get 5 because I didn't change C, right? But this is a reference data type. And so what D is it's just a pointer to, D and C are pointing to the same object. Your book had this analogy that for reference data types, these variables are like remote controls. And however many remote controls you have, you just have one TV, and if you use one remote control to change the channel, you change the channel. If you go walk over and you take your other remote control and you change the channel, you've also changed the channel. So with reference data types, that's the behavior. Thank you for your attention today, and see you on Friday. Good luck in the lab. Wait, let me stop the recording. Hang up.